I am Amir Pasek. I am the Eugene R. Temple Dean of the IU Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to the 18th annual Thomas Lake Lecture. The Lake Lecture is a highlight of our academic year. It allows us to draw attention to exceptional work in the field that is nurtured by the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving. And we are honored this evening that Mona Siddiqui is with us this evening, exemplifying the inspirational work that we seek to nurture. I want to welcome all of you who are assembled with us here in person and the several hundred of you joining us online from across the world. I am pleased we have so many of our students in person and online, including those in our bachelor's, master's, and PhD programs, as well as our newest students who are starting our professional doctorate in philanthropic leadership. I also want to thank our alumni for joining in, and I want to welcome members of our Board of Visitors and the Lake Institute Board of Advisors. I also want to thank our interim chancellor for IUPUI, Andy Klein, for joining us this evening as well. Finally, thanks to St. Luke's United Methodist Church for hosting us in their welcoming space. The Lake Lecture is a significant punctuation point for us each year because it also allows us to recall the generosity of the past, a past that has made our work and our ambitions possible today. We all share the good fortune of benefiting this evening from the vision of Karen Lake Buttry, continued after her passing by Don Buttry and their family. In 2002, she designated a bequest from her parents' estate to Indiana University to establish Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, which honors the legacy of Tom and Marjorie Lake by exploring the dynamic relationship between faith and giving through research, education, and training. In addition, the annual Thomas H. Lake Lecture was established to bring renowned speakers to Indianapolis to promote greater understanding at the intersections of faith and giving. I am grateful to be participating with you in this vital legacy of inspiration and understanding. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce my good colleague, Dr. David King, the Karen Lake Buttry Director of Lake Institute on Faith and Giving and Associate Professor of Philanthropic Studies. An award-winning scholar, teacher, and public intellectual, Professor King has written a terrific book on world vision. He has run major research projects to understand congregational dynamics and has engaged students, practitioners, and the media to deepen understandings of the connections between religion and philanthropy. And we should also be pleased that he used his sabbatical last year as Fulbright professor at the University of Edinburgh to recruit this evening's distinguished guest. Please join me in welcoming David.
Thanks, Amir. And as the Karen Lake Buttry Director of the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, it is my pleasure to add my welcome to Dean Pasek's for this, our 18th annual Thomas H. Lake Lecture. This definitely is a highlight of our year at Lake Institute, and our gathering this evening would not be possible without the example of Tom and Marjorie Lake and their philanthropic kindness offered to us in their honor by Karen Lake Buttry and Donald Buttry. The Lake and Buttry families have instilled a legacy of thoughtful consideration about faith and giving in what I hope will continue to inform our mutual understanding and the flourishing of our communities wherever we might find ourselves. We are so delighted to host this in-person event here in our local Indianapolis community, but we're also grateful in so many of you that are joining this conversation online from wherever you may find yourselves. And we hope that you will feel free to follow up with us at Lake Institute and the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Please let us find ways to connect around this mutual work together. We would love to work together to address these complex but so necessary topics at the intersection of faith and giving. And so on that note, I have the distinct privilege of introducing my friend and colleague, Dr. Mona Siddiqui, to address us this evening as our Thomas H. Lake Lecturer. Professor Siddiqui is an internationally renowned academic, cultural commentator, and broadcaster on the BBC Radio. She served as Professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies and Assistant Principal for Religion and Society at the University of Edinburgh. She's also currently the Erko Visiting Professor in Studies on Contemporary Society at the Helsinki Collegium of Advanced Studies in Finland. And she served visiting roles in the U.S. as well as Distinguished Professor at Hartford International University and visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Dr. Siddiqui is a scholar of Islamic law and ethics, as well as Christian-Muslim relations. She's the author of over 8 books. Her most recent work has reflected her interest in the virtues of hospitality, gratitude, fidelity, and loyalty. She previously published Hospitality in Islam, Welcoming in God's Name, from Yale University Press, based on her 2016 Gifford Lectures. Second maybe only to the Thomas H. Lake Lecture, one of the most prestigious lectureships in theology and ethics in the world. She's recently co-edited a Theology of Gratitude from Cambridge University Press this past year and is set to publish Faith and Fidelity in Islamic Thought from Edinburgh University Press in 2023. But beyond these academic publications, you might explore her podcast, Living Gratefully, where she interviews leaders from all walks of life about how gratitude shapes relationships in our life together, from Cornel West and former Archbishop of Canterbury Rowan Williams to politicians and stand-up comedians. Professor Siddiqui is an internationally sought-after public speaker on religion, ethics, and public life, a regular commentator in the media, known especially for appearances on BBC Radio 4 and Radio Scotland's Thought for the Day. Siddiqui has been honored extensively for her scholarship and her contributions to public life. She was awarded an OBE, Officer of the Order of the British Empire, for her interfaith work, and has been shortlisted by multiple publications as one of the most influential people in the United Kingdom. She sits on the board of the UK Holocaust Memorial Foundation, as well as a number of other civic organizations. She's been a regular expert report writer and witness on a variety of legal cases involving religious practice for multiple decades. And she received the Archbishop of Canterbury's Hubert Walter Award for Reconciliation and Interfaith Cooperation. She's been elected an honorary member and first speaker of the Royal Scottish Academy, vice president international at the Royal Society of Edinburgh, where she's a fellow. And she holds 6 honorary doctorates, and I could go on, but I will stop only in order to make the most time for Professor Siddiqui to share her thoughts with us tonight in her Thomas H. Lake Lecture entitled Art, Philanthropy, and Belonging, the Disruptive Nature of Giving. So please help me welcome Professor Siddiqui.
Thank you, everyone. First of all, deep gratitude to David, the Lake Institute, the Lilly Foundation, and all of you for making time to come. As I said earlier, this is my first visit to this part of America, and I really wanted to thank Anne as well for all the background work that she's done in order to facilitate this event. So I'm not a scholar of philanthropy, but in this lecture, I just want to explore what I think is a fundamental essence which I see lies in the act of giving, but alongside other concepts such as gratitude and hospitality. And in fact, the more I analyzed the intentions behind philanthropy and its societal effects, the relationship to gratitude and hospitality became stronger. When I sent David this title, I was unaware that the word disruptive had featured in a recent KPMG report, Disruptive Philanthropists, How a New Wave of Modern Philanthropists Are Shaping Tomorrow. The report is based on the new wave of philanthropic activity emerging from the post-COVID world. And it looks at selective philanthropists in Canada and more globally, affirming that the relationship between private wealth, philanthropy, and society is as complex and personal as it is rewarding. The passion and hunger to make the world a better place still drives activity, but, I quote, the simple act of giving money to deserving causes while still at the heart of philanthropic endeavor is not enough. So as I read the report, I wondered whether the act of giving is ever simple. As a person of faith, I'm reminded constantly to give. And I think it's precisely because giving isn't easy. It demands something of me, not just materially, but also emotionally and psychologically. It demands that I don't turn away or remain indifferent, that I see and listen to the inequalities around me and try and do something for another human being. The command to give can be as challenging as the command to love. And we can see both commands as gifts or tasks from God, because both confirm that our ethical life is relational, and that we cannot speak about our collective life if we fail to speak of our collective obligations. Faith itself, I think, is a gift from God, but it is also responsibility. Through revelation, God has given of himself, and in both Christianity and Islam, God chooses to intervene in human history. In Islam, there is no divine accolade bigger than the election of prophecy. The prophet messenger is chosen to be close to God and to receive something from him, while remaining responsible to his immediate social context. The elements in the human divine dialectic come together, but they remain in distinct realms. In Christianity, however, human prophecy is simply not sufficient to define either Jesus or his being or his acts. The Hellenistic development of Christology, the Christological councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon, pointed to a different truth, a truth which stated that Jesus was the Christ, the Word and revelation of God. But this fundamental creedal difference aside, one of the main messages both scriptures share is human-to-human responsibility. The duty we have to one another, that God is there not only when we turn to him, but perhaps more so when we turn to each other. For example, prayer, kindness, and charity are often grouped together in the Quran as if they carry the same moral and spiritual worth. Worship none but God. Treat with kindness your parents and kindred, and orphans and those in need. Speak fair to the people. Be steadfast in prayer, and practice regular charity. Be steadfast in prayer and practice regular charity. Whatever good you send forth for your souls before you, you shall find it in God. And you will never attain righteousness until you spend in charity from what you have. The classical world had no religious or ethical impulse for individual charity. Personal concern for the poor and needy was an important theme in the Hebrew scriptures, which gave rise to the insistence in later Judaism that almsgiving is a duty and even the highest virtue. And this emphasis was appropriated by Christianity and is mentioned often in the passages of the New Testament, where charity is represented as an outgrowth of agape, which itself is rooted in the nature of God. Just as God loved humans, so they were expected to respond to divine love by extending love to one another. Love of God and devotion to Christ provided the motivation for love of others that had its practical outworking in charity. So Hebrews 13:16, do not forget to do good and to share with others, for with such sacrifices God is pleased. Luke 12, sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. The love which is contained in these divine commands is not an abstract, but concretely rooted in sharing with others. It is the love which Christine Pohl refers to in her work on hospitality. The practice of hospitality forces abstract commitments of loving the neighbor, stranger, and enemy into practical and personal expressions of respect and care for actual neighbors, strangers, and enemies. The twin moves of universalizing the neighbor and personalizing the stranger are at the core of hospitality. Claims of loving all humankind or welcoming the other have to be accompanied, she says, by the hard work of actually welcoming a human being into a real place. Many of the commands of the Quran can be seen as reminders that there is a recognized right for the needy and the deprived over our wealth. The Quran is clear that the world hasn't been created equal or just, and the verses which speak of giving to the poor and the needy or the traveler can be considered as multiple ways of creating a relationship with those outside our immediate family and friends. The principle of zakat, a third pillar of Islam, is also about our own moral self-preservation, that our wealth neither controls nor consumes us, because if it's not used to help others, the tradition says, there is no burden greater than the burden of a rich person depriving the needy. So zakat becomes a pillar of Islam where charity is optional, but all are to be used for the poor and the needy. those whose hearts are being reconciled. The distinction between zakat, sadaqah, and hospitality can often blur, and emphasis is upon the individual to give according to their ability. So I see that rich and poor are not defined in any category, and wealth and poverty are not measured in any systematic way. But giving what you could to others went beyond the obligation on the rich to the poor. Giving to others is both a personal as well as an institutional way of expanding our social conscience and recognizing that wealth is a temporary tool, and we have a choice over how we use it. And if one has nothing to give, then doing good for others and to others was also a sublime act of charity. In her work, Charity in Islamic Societies, Amy Singer writes that the role of charity in the ideals of Islam and the enormous repertoire of practices associated with it from around the globe and across time requires that anyone seeking to understand Muslims or Islam pay attention to these and not dismiss them as being of secondary importance, or worse, none at all. So the Quran speaks of giving in multiple ways as part of a wider narrative of hospitality. Muslim societies developed a culture of a ubiquity of charity because much of the Quranic emphasis is on giving to those in need, basically creating a new social order. But the themes and persons around which this ethical imperative to give and share is framed are to be found in the pre-Islamic milieu, where Bedouin societies already laid an enormous emphasis on hospitality as central to a noble character. So generosity is part of hospitality and consists first and foremost in providing food. And I just want to give you a personal anecdote here as to how this book sort of came into my consciousness. And a very personal anecdote was when I was first traveling as a young undergraduate. I went to Cairo, and I went to Cairo with my friend who had an uncle who lived there. They were very middle class, and her uncle came and picked her up, and off he took her to his flat. And I was kind of left there in a really rural, poor part of Cairo. And I just looked around, and there were sheep and donkeys and cattle. Everything was around me, apart from the people that needed to be there. And a young woman was sat on the steps of this building, and she just kept looking at me. And then eventually she took a piece of cardboard and just dusted it down and put it next to her and beckoned to me to sit down. And I kind of smiled nervously because I didn't know obviously who she was or anything. But I did sit down with her while my hosts arrived. And then later on that evening, 2 children kept coming up to my flat, knocking on the door, and they spoke a dialect of Arabic that I really couldn't understand. And they knocked a few times, and I was getting slightly impatient. And it was the next day that I realized these 2 children had been sent by the same woman, they were her children, to ask if I needed anything because I was a guest in their neighborhood. And I think that the reason this story has stayed with me because I felt so ashamed and ungracious because I was getting impatient with the children. But I also think that it's these very simple acts of kindness when we least expect it that kind of mark our lives and which we remember long after we've left that life behind. Going back to the pre-modern Arabian context, I want to emphasize how much literature there is on hospitality of that time, because hospitality was considered as a fundamental virtue of the desert environment. It's been explained that the important role that hospitality played in the harsh desert environment was because if you refused a person refreshment in such a place, you were virtually letting that person die. And so therefore, the open-handedness of the nomadic people depended on each other's hospitality. There's much emphasis on this as a humanizing element, where along with honor and chivalry, hospitality was considered as an act of unconditional surrender to the needs of others. But it should also be noted that for the pagan Arab, charity was not simply a natural manifestation of feelings of tribal solidarity, because it very often extended way beyond one's own tribe, nor was it always dictated by the motive of benevolence and kindness. It was first and foremost an act of chivalry. A person who could make a royal display of his generosity was seen as a true dandy of the desert. So it seems that though graciousness is often associated with giving well, by which people usually mean giving without hope of recognition or reward, there is also an aspect of the self and the ego that makes giving an act of display, a desire to be recognized. And maybe this is where charitable giving, which is encouraged in scriptural traditions to be secretive or private, is distinct from the more public face of philanthropy. Philanthropy is not a solitary activity. It is a journey defined by collaboration, continuous learning and advice. And as someone said, philanthropy is a marathon, not a sprint. She adds, this is an African philanthropist, that collaboration is the only way to achieve scale and achieve goals quicker. Zarina Scriwala, whose background is in TV and film production, compares philanthropy to creating a blockbuster film. Imagine, she says, trying to create a film and deciding to produce it, direct it, act in it, do the sound, the lighting, the costumes. It would be ridiculous. But that is what a lot of people try to do in philanthropy. The literature on philanthropy and hospitality or charity often distinguishes philanthropy as more strategic, more public, more donor-centric, more long-term, whereas charity is more immediate, spontaneous, more focused on the recipient. But I was considering the main advantages of philanthropy, and I came up with a few as I looked at the literature. Philanthropy engages a variety of actors, typically sitting outside the confines of government and business, and they're often free to direct wealth and influence in ways of their choosing. Philanthropy is a desire to promote the welfare of others, generally expressed through the giving of time, talent, and treasure. While generally philanthropy is oriented towards charity, we now need it more than ever across all segments of society. Philanthropy can also heal economic disparities. Think about how a scholarship can provide a life-changing experience to a student, lifting them out of poverty or deprivation. Philanthropy can heal hunger and can provide entertainment and humor that eliminates hopelessness and hurt. Philanthropy is not a handout, it's a hands up. When someone falls, we help them. They feel better, and we feel better for doing so, because helping heals. But while I contend that this sort of giving in its multiple forms may be a moral impulse, the basis for giving is about the importance, I think, of how we get a more just society. And this is a structural and societal issue, and one that philanthropic giving can only partially address. Of course, it's good that the soup kitchen can feed the hungry and homeless, the NGOs which help women to gain local work, children to read, but there are real structural issues. And I want to give a couple of examples. Currently in the UK, we have the cost of living crisis, which has really happened, was happening over COVID, but then has been exacerbated by the issues with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. More and more people are using food banks, and I feel that we should not be normalizing food banks. There was a stark data in the Big Issue magazine recently. The Food Standard Agency showed that almost 1 in 4 consumers, this is over the last 2 years, now report skipping a meal or cutting the size of meals due to lack of money to buy food. And that 15% of consumers reported using a food bank in March 2022. That for every person who visits a food bank, there are so many more who are struggling to afford food but are too ashamed to seek help. Secondly, without a change in public policy, the structural inequalities remain. Robert Reich's critique of some American philanthropists must be noted here, and I'm sure some of you are probably already aware of that. And he argues, the wealthy have long used America's system of philanthropy to advance their interests, often at the expense of everyone else. It's not just the plutocratic bias of this system that's problematic, it's also the broader way that an educated class of professional change makers working on philanthropy's ever-expanding payroll has come to dominate civil society in recent decades. During this same time, perhaps not coincidentally, many ordinary Americans have withdrawn from civic life and come to stew in growing anger about the power of elites. In other words, he argues, state-subsidized philanthropy may account for a hollowing out and weakening of civil society, the exact opposite result of what many champions of giving say they want. The defense for individual deduction for donations to these civic organizations, the income tax exemptions for charitable operations are more than just tax rules. He argues they form a vital legal boundary between the state and civil society. They are not subsidies for civil society, but rather fences that keep government from interfering in a sector that is vital to our national freedom. Money you give away for public benefit is neither part of your income nor the government's money to claim. But if we agree with Professor Reich that philanthropy can be paternalistic, a mask for the judgmental approach to the position of people who are in need and about the things they should be doing differently to lift themselves out of poverty or disadvantage, that philanthropy can often come with strings attached, a demand that the donor be elevated rather than the people that they are serving, is a solution to make philanthropic giving unconditional. And I don't think that unconditionality in human transaction is either workable or a virtue. Nor do I think that complete social and economic equality is either possible or a realistic goal. Because liberal democracies flourish not on complete equality or sameness, but when we create conditions where everyone is given a chance, or maybe even a second chance, and that they have some opportunity to live out their potential, irrespective of their gender, race, religion, or economic background. For me, this requires not only monetary distribution, but also the distribution of power. Being a good citizen isn't only about cultivating an individual sense of belonging, but ensuring that others are also made to feel that they belong. And as I was saying earlier at our lunchtime conversation, liberal democracies thrive on people of different backgrounds and beliefs being able to live together because they feel that for all their differences, cultural, economic, educational, that they have a stake in the moral and public life of a country. Philanthropy has the unique ability to take risks in ways that no other form of financing can, to attract more capital that builds long-term prosperity and sustainability. For philanthropists, this requires time, patience, and focus, an awareness of many different connected ecosystems. One prominent Indian philanthropist says, you need to be an ecosystem player. And that might mean dropping the competitive mindset often associated with ambitious business leaders. Without government backing, many societal programs simply will not get off the ground. Whether looking to improve early years education in India, student literacy in Australia, social care in Scotland, or empowering rural communities in India, where an end might be 20 to 25 years away, collaborating with policymakers is the only answer. And this is why, for me, it is justice rather than charity which must lie at the center of philanthropic giving. Philanthropy is commendable, said Martin Luther King, but it must not cause the philanthropists to overlook the circumstances of economic injustice which make philanthropy necessary. Philanthropists and philanthropic advisors who champion equality must work to shift from a framework that grounds giving in charity to one that grounds giving in justice. If we want greater justice, we need greater balance. The Canadian academic Henry Mintzberg suggests that we require nothing less than a reformation on a global scale to rebalance our heads, our societies, and our world. He cautions that despite all the effort to deal with our problems, climate change, social injustices, the demise of democracy, and more, we will make no headway until these efforts consolidate around a common cause, that is, how we restore balance. Until we all understand that combating inequality is that common cause, he argues we will continue to fail, and that philanthropy itself needs to do some serious soul-searching. That justice is often portrayed as balancing of scales is no coincidence. I emphasize justice, which is a weighty scriptural word. A few examples. Be just, for this is closest to righteousness. These are Quranic examples. And the word of your Lord has been fulfilled in truth and justice. None can change his words. When you judge between people, judge with justice. The very concept of khilafah, or stewardship, is aligned with just rule on earth. And yet, God does not promise us that the world will be just, rather that it is us who need to pursue what is just. In fact, there are some startling traditions which emphasize that wealth is intrinsically to be shared, not amassed. That the Prophet said, "Beware of sitting with the dead," and when he was asked, "Who are the dead?" he said, "Every rich person whose wealth has made a tyrant of him." But rather than defining justice in the abstract, these prophetic and Quranic traditions call on people to act justly and assert the justness of God. Muslim exegesis of the verses that mention justice in the Quran offer little by way of a systematic discussion of justice. Rather, the Quran seems replete with verses which state that doing good is the same as doing just, and that both are signs of God. Despite widespread acknowledgement of the significance of justice in Islamic thought, there have been relatively few systematic studies of Islamic conceptions of justice. Justice has usually been treated tangentially in relation to theories of government. But the reason why is not because it's not been a concern, quite the opposite. In his article on conceptions of political justice in early Islam, Franz Rosenthal commented indirectly on the dearth of scholarship in this area, but said that this wasn't because Muslims considered justice irrelevant, it was because of the tremendous importance of justice, and injustice in human political and social affairs was self-evident. The existence of justice and the need for it in order to maintain any social organism was taken so much for granted that except in restricted philosophical circles, no further, more profound study of the problem of justice was felt to be required. And it's often said that those who find themselves on the advantageous side of injustice tend to be highly reluctant to give up their privilege because no one wants to believe that their privilege is supported by injustice. But I think that justice can be very elusive. At the same time, there are people willing to change, to give up privilege and advantage for others. They drive people to think differently. They inspire the young to think of new worlds, because very often the thinking mind is the unsettled mind. It wants to see change. And this can occur with a range of issues, such as racism, gender inequality, sexual inequality, poverty, abuse of children. People set up charities, groups, and philanthropic organizations to counter what they see as injustice and to create societies where the theory and the intention may well be that everyone feels they have a place and that they belong. But justice is also a popular word, a word we often exchange with rights or fairness. Indeed, the dictionary meaning of justice is a legal or philosophical theory by which fairness is administered. But I think justice is more than fairness. It demands addressing a wrong, recognizing a right greater than my own, a concern greater than my own need. The reason why people talk about justice all the time is because it is one of the most fundamental social, ethical, and moral principles that we have to deal with every day. And it's also, I think, intrinsic to the way we feel about belonging and citizenship. Despite the ubiquity of this word, most of us don't really think of justice in any meaningful way until we ourselves experience a personal injustice. Justice is a word which often crops up in language around meaning and the good life. But it seems to me that justice isn't a state we arrive at. It's an ideal about putting something right, a word, a deed, an emotion. It's not about restoring a bygone age, but creating a new world order. And for me, this is where hope and imagination and art come together. The search for restoration after any injury compels us to look inwards, reset our boundaries, and reflect on what can be repaired and what remains irreparable. I see gratitude as a response to human vulnerability and the vicissitudes of life. COVID-19 was also a kind of rupture, something which breaks in us and which leaves its mark. A rupture, a break with the past, whether voluntary or imposed, always demands a new beginning of sorts. The famous Indian writer Arundhati Roy speaks of what might be new possibilities, and I quote, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it." But rupture is not new. Many religious traditions understand rupture as a metaphor for all human earthly life. We have the fall, and in the Quranic story, we have a signification of rupture as the expulsion of Adam and Eve from paradise. The Quranic equivalent of the Genesis story is a paradigm of the breaking out from innocence to disobedience, from desire to knowledge. Adam gives in to Iblis' seduction and temptation, thereby making his first act of freedom an act of ingratitude and human vulnerability. But this ingratitude goes deeper. It is a turning away, a repudiation of God and divine attention and care. But this dramatic entry, or whether we call it sin or disobedience entering the world, is a story of a human struggle. It is a struggle from the fear of the unseen and Adam's longing for God to re-establish their former relationship of love and dialogue. But there is no return to that former state. As I reflect on these last few years, it seems to me that when we have trauma, hope can live amongst fear and grief, where it can be nurtured. And a society which lives on the right side of hope creates possibilities for new beginnings. But hope is also a process, a doing word, cultivated in small acts of generosity between family and friends, but perhaps mainly between people who don't know each other. It shines through prophetic social and political milestones when we have the courage to reach and work for more empathetic societies. And imagination is about seeing and understanding the world, and this is in itself inherently a moral activity. It is through observation that we become aware of the human freedom to think and act, of our relational existence, of a moral impulse to make things better. Without effort and change, things do not improve. And as Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, wrote, "It is not a finished utopia that we ought to desire, but a world where imagination and hope are alive and active." Philanthropy can help curate and influence greater freedom. It can help civil society reimagine the world, because we cannot simply dwell on destruction and grief. We have to think past it and be a source of inspiration for others. As scholars engaged in the liberal arts, our work does not lie on the margins of society. It is essential and central to the development of thought and culture, of rebuilding society. The English historian Arnold Toynbee believed that civilizations are always confronted with challenges, and that societies either flourish, flounder, and ultimately fall based on whether a creative minority crafts the right response to these challenges. So whatever our individual concerns, our collective responsibility may well lie in being the prophetic voices which can show people another way. We need to stretch our imagination to think of justice and hope. Claire Streen writes that appeals to the imagination is an ethic in itself. Such appeals are poetic. They convey information intuitively rather than analytically. Human beings did not have to wait for philosophers to know something substantial about their own existence. They always had an immediate intuition of the nature of the whole, an awareness to which storytellers, poets, and other artists contributed. So our moral vision for life are most compelling when they say something about how all of us relate to one another in the here and now. And the subtext for moral sources can't always be theistic ways, because we live in an increasingly secular world. But imagination at its best brings all aspects of life into an intricate whole, showing us the strength and the complexity of human interconnectedness. For educationalists like the American Irving Babbitt, The true purpose of education was to assimilate the wisdom of the ages through the right use of the human imagination. And he argued that art was essential to creating community. And I quote, "What creates community, what advances civilization and the happiness of the human person, is that which takes the individual away from their impulsive, natural self-conceit and offers a larger reality revealed through the lessons of the ages. These lessons, exemplified in great works of literature and history, communicate the larger world and stimulate the moral imagination of the student with reference to a shared human center." Oscar Wilde wrote that a map of the world that does not include utopia is not even worth glancing at, for it is about one country at which humanity is always landing. And when humanity lands there, it looks out and sees a better country. It sets sail. Progress is a realization of utopias. But it is said that utopias exist in our imagination as better futures. Human beings become who they are and develop their view of the world through the interplay of will, imagination, and reason. And it is most fundamentally through imagination that an individual or group of people hold an intuitive sense of what is right, real, wrong, good, true, or beautiful. It isn't that most of us are unaware of the justices of society. Proverbs 31:8 says, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute." But we do need an ethical consciousness within our political imagination. As Chiara Bottici says, in an epoch when politics is said to be simply a question of good governance, of good administration within a neoliberal consensus, the paradox is that of lack of political imagination. When it comes to philanthropy, it must be about engaging citizens as well as giving to them. Citizenship isn't simply about having the right passport, it is also a mindset and an emotion of finding home somewhere. And it seems to me that many people today feel they don't have a home or that they don't belong because of societal indifference, inequality, and even contempt. Alex Lebec and Rafia Qureshi say, philanthropy today, and indeed in the future, needs to take on a long-term view with a catalytic and flexible approach. By not embracing the full power of philanthropic capital, many philanthropists are missing a monumental opportunity to make real change happen at scale. The good news is that sitting alongside traditional philanthropic structures is a new wave of social entrepreneurs, women and millennials, and venture philanthropists and impact investors who are disrupting this sector and creating long-lasting and impactful change. I want to conclude with just a few reflections. A central question for scholars of religion and in the liberal arts is how we should restore to the humanities and the social sciences a sense of transcendent moral purpose. Why should any artistic quest or interest, including writing, be about transformation of the self and society? For most, any pursuit of the arts, especially literature, engages our inner life. The inner life where most of us live our lives, the space that teaches us empathy. The arts elevate society above its purely practical needs. They give value to human existence, pondering on the desires and restlessness which make us fully human. James Smith describes this as the ultimate love, because for human beings, things matter in ways that we can't often articulate. For those of us who have an ancestral migrant history, I have wondered whether we make a conscious decision to call a place home, or does it just happen if you live long enough in some place? I feel that for me, it was education and learning which gave me a sense of formation and feeling rooted. And over the years, I feel very privileged and humbled to have learnt with some inspirational educators who cared about leaving the world a slightly better place, a more thoughtful place, who emphasized that all of us are sentient and moral beings. The combination of inspired education and a safe public space has brought about a kind of liberation, but also the realization that what we do and say in society, no matter who we are and where we are speaking, matters at every stage of our lives, and that serving and caring are essential to virtuous living. We should live with the moral obligation to give something back, sometimes for no other reason than it is the right thing to do, because we know that we flourish more as individuals when we help others to flourish around us. A life that is only about personal ambition is not morally deficient, but it does become a life of the self rather than a life of charity. A life of giving back in some way, and a life which is only about the fulfillment of your own desires will eventually end up feeling rather empty. For me, being aware of difference between cultures, religions, and backgrounds is paradoxically and fundamentally about recognizing the interconnectedness of human civilizations. And I don't simply mean the effects of mass movements and globalization. Rather, in a world where all cultural expressions are from everywhere, where we engage, even collide with difference, how do we create safe civil society where the ethics of empathy can be debated and lived? And I certainly don't mean by this the homogenization of society, but wise and engaged citizenship where people feel they belong, and they are also made to feel that they belong, because peace, justice, and community are all fragile. Our protective layer in civil societies is relatively peaceful coexistence, but within that, the liquidity of our societies is an ever-increasing phenomenon. In much of the Western world, we're living with a particular paradox. The postmodern ethos declared that there are no great stories that can provide us with an overarching explanation on the meaning of existence, of human existence, or give us universal moral principles. Indeed, we are left on our own to find ethical guidelines to be applied in culturally, politically, and economically different environments. In this sense, religion has become a question of faith, while science has been a question of knowledge. The particular angst of the modern age is that there seem to be no more meta-narratives about how to lead the good life. But I think this is why philanthropy continues to be a significant aspect of civil society, because it has the potential to create new meaning, and it can disrupt this narrative. So let me conclude with a few lines from the Nigerian-British poet and novelist, Ben Okri. But we live in times that have lost this tough art of dreaming. Can we still seek the lost angels of our better natures? Can we still wish and will for poverty's death and a newer way, to undo war and find peace in the labyrinth of the Middle East, and prosperity in Africa as a true way? To end the feared tide of immigration, we dream of a new politics that will renew the world. Under their weary, suspicious gaze, there's always a new way, a better way that's not been tried before. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. Thank you for that wonderful tour de force of so many great thoughts. Thinking about these big themes of philanthropy, of generosity and hospitality. So just in thinking about giving, oftentimes maybe as a moral obligation, but you're encouraging us to really push that beyond a moral obligation as a practice to reimagine. What would that look like? What kind of practices would help move from realizing giving as something we have to do to giving as something we need to do in order to live our lives together and to reimagine the world in that way?
So I don't see giving necessarily as just materially giving. Not everyone can give materially, and nor should everyone feel that they have to give materially. But I think giving with your time, because I think we need to broaden out what giving is and what charity is. We tend to think of these things in very material ways. But giving of your time, and we have a very flourishing voluntary sector, but giving wherever you see any kind of need. It's not that it doesn't happen, but I don't think we emphasize it as a virtue. We think of it as something that is about the service industry, that young people should be made to feel, go out and do some good work. But how do you sustain that throughout your whole life? That's my real concern, because only if you sustain good action throughout your whole life do you transform society. These are not time-limited things.
And if giving is, or generosity is a virtue, is a practice that you can get better at, or you can, it's a lifelong, what would that look like compared to a sector approach to it? How would you encourage us to think about giving as a virtue that we develop over time?
Well, I don't think that kind of giving can come with any conditions. And I don't think that kind of giving necessarily comes with, I want to transform cities and landscapes, even though I think there's a virtue in that as well. But it comes, all good work for me, all dialogue, all good work, all benevolence is local. It starts small. And so therefore what you're really doing is maybe turning somebody's life around in a very small way, but perhaps giving them a bit of hope to carry on. And I think it's very easy for many people to feel there is no hope, that there is no future, there is no prosperity in their lives or their children's lives. So how does one, that doesn't necessarily call for massive philanthropic donation, but it does call for individuals and people to come and say, no, you have value, your life is worth living, and this is how we're going to make it better. So I'm kind of differentiating between philanthropic giving, which is structural, and maybe societal and very public, to maybe giving that is, maybe just goes unnoticed, but it's in that unnoticing of it that's where change takes place.
And while not specifically tied to just religious giving, but oftentimes our religious traditions have been that kind of, whether it's anonymous or regular types of giving, that someone is distinct from the ways we think of larger philanthropy. Would you unpack maybe how our religious traditions sometimes have that regular practice of giving that maybe look distinct from the philanthropic practices of today?
Well, I think the most common example of that is in recent years, how religious organizations have come together, pool their resources to open up food banks, to work together for humanitarian crises. And something that I hadn't seen until very recently, where different religious charities are actively now pooling their resources to work together, as opposed to just working in an area, but separately. And I think that's because people realize that real action is not about creedal differences. Real action that transforms society is about people just coming together to work. Whether their faith motivates them, whether their work motivates them, it doesn't matter. It's the end result that counts.
In some sense, I was really struck by the story of your visit to Egypt and this notion of hospitality. Would you say that hospitality may be that sort of formational virtue, that frame that giving becomes a wider frame in order for us to help bring people together for citizenship, home, belonging? What are the roles between those virtues?
So I don't want to romanticize hospitality, and I don't want to idealize it, because the work I've done on hospitality is really about the limits and ethic of hospitality. Hospitality is not unconditional. The host-guest relationship cannot be unconditional, because no one really means it when they say, make my home your home. We mostly want our guests to leave after a while. You know, we want our guests to be comfortable, but we don't want them to make permanently their home. So I think that, if you translate the host-guest relationship to a civic environment, and what we were discussing earlier, well, if you want people to live together with elements of peace and tolerance and just kindness and empathy, there are limits on what that public space can look like, where everybody has a say. It is not absolute freedom for anyone, and it is not about saying that, you are welcome at any cost. Because I don't think, what we don't want is the unintended consequence of unconditional hospitality, which may end up being resentment. That I have done this for you, I've received nothing back. And there's nothing wrong with having conditions, and there's nothing wrong with having boundaries. But I think we tend to romanticize these things as they have to be unconditional. Love has to be unconditional. Love is never unconditional. And so why not create societies where people are aware that there is a transactional nature? It doesn't have to be crude, but you grow into this sense that society is about give and take, and that our lives are about give and take. So the more we are conscious of that, the more we are sensitive that when I'm in public life, I'm aware of other people's freedoms, other people's views. That actually puts a sense of control on my own freedom. That is not a bad thing.
And often in the study of philanthropy, we're focused on tax deductions and other types of but you're in some sense disrupting some of that conversation by turning towards the liberal arts or some of these types of virtues. What would you encourage us as we study this in an interdisciplinary way, whether they're students here, other scholars, your practitioners who work in the nonprofit sector? What can we learn from sort of some of that disruption of the ways in which we can think about giving, hospitality as practices or virtues? How would you push us to think?
I think it's really important that anyone in the liberal arts is proud to be in the liberal arts. You know, we are not the Cinderella of university disciplines. And I think that we, you know, when Toni Morrison said when trauma, I can't remember her exact words, but she said artists go to work. You know, when something really bad happens, it's artists, it's the arts that lifts society, that gives meaning again. And I do think that we should not see our work as being on the margins of society. Our work is central to how we shape society. Yes, of course we need STEM, of course we need science and technology. No one is ever going to deny that. But, you know, when we feel low, when things aren't going right, when we feel alone, we don't turn to STEM. We turn to literature and poetry and music. And those are the things that give a metaphor to our existence. They give meaning. Because otherwise, our existence is only measured by numbers and data and matrices. That's not what makes us human. So I think that, you know, we should see philanthropy, if it sits in the liberal arts, as very much about imagining new justices, new worlds, and being aware that new worlds and new justices, of course, STEM allows for new worlds and new justices. Look at all the, you know, the technological advancement in medical science, etc. But so does the liberal arts. That also shapes new worlds and new justices. So I would just say, yeah, use the place where you're at to really push the boundaries of what imagination can be, or what rethinking society can look like.
Two other quick questions, and I'll invite those around here. Maybe we'll have some microphones where you can voice a question as well. So if you had a chance to sit down with a new philanthropist, maybe they're a tech entrepreneur and they're ready to disrupt philanthropy or disrupt to solve some pressing crisis, what would your advice be to them, coming from some of the framing that you've brought?
Can you ask that again? That's far too complicated.
Yeah, there's a new philanthropist out there,
okay.
and they want to make a difference in the world. They're okay. Trying to reimagine the world.
Okay.
How could you help? How would you guide them in some? You talk about Rob Reich and others, and how would you bring your own background to advise a new philanthropist?
Start small. That's what I would advise. Like, reimagine the world sounds great, but you only reimagine and make change locally and in your immediate vicinity. And I think it depends very much on what the philanthropist would want to change. But whatever sector that they wanted to invest in or rethink, it would have to be, first of all, why? Why do you want to do this? And usually there's a personal story why people want to do this. But then how does that personal story reflect on what it is that you want to change? Because philanthropy, for me, from the stuff that I've read, isn't simply about transforming the look of a city or the investment in a city, or it essentially has to be about giving people a sense of agency over their lives as well, so that they don't feel indebted, that once that investment goes, that they can't do anything else. And that is why gratitude is also a problem at times, because gratitude too can lead to feelings of indebtedness. Like, I've been able to do this because you helped me. Now I feel I owe you something, even if the intention wasn't that I have to give anything back. But I think that once you take people's autonomy away from them by giving and helping too much, you're actually not helping the situation. So I do think that agency and the sense of my life is still in my control is really important.
And we at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy always talk about all of us are philanthropists, so we want to democratize that language. So, and we've talked about our tech entrepreneur example, but for all of us here, whether of philanthropists of all shapes and sizes, one trend we're worried about in the US, and I know it's also true in the UK from some of the data that I've seen, is that we have a decline in the number of households of Americans that are giving. So less than half of American households are giving or volunteering on an annual basis. So if that giving is a part of what we need to do to reimagine our life together, what would be the encouragement to all of us to find ways, what role should giving or generosity play in our life together?
Can I just ask why the trend has gone down, why people aren't giving?
Well, we're at the School of Philanthropy, we're trying to actually discern just what that looks like.
Okay.
There could be a number of reasons. It could be everything from from changes in tax law, but also maybe declines in trust in institutions, decline in religious affiliation. These are questions that we're trying to ask as to what is leading to that decline in giving.
I mean, one of the things, I don't think it's a direct parallel, but maybe there's some, like universities generally, which is the world I come from, are really keen for you to bring in funding, okay? You bring in funding and half of it's swallowed up. You have no idea where it goes. And you think, I did all the work, and you've swallowed up half of the money, and I have no idea whether it's actually gone to anything good. It's probably gone to a central coffer, and I will never see it again. And I think maybe there's a parallel. Maybe people don't see that their money is actually transforming the way that they wanted things to be transformed. Or maybe they think that it's too much caught in red tape. I don't know. But I think this is why I always say start small, anything, because small acts of giving or charity or good works can be just as transformative in people's lives as thinking, in huge, large investment terms. But I wonder whether, in answer to your question, the main thing is, it may not have anything to do with about my individual material wealth. It may be that I just don't see the results. And I feel that with university life, to be honest. Like, where does all that money go? And no one ever answers that question.
Right. Well, I'm gonna leave that one and go.
This is especially for you.
But I think you shine a really important point on this notion that oftentimes what we might not see is a decline in giving, but a transformation in the kind of giving that's happening. So what we oftentimes can't see or shine a line on, the forms of informal giving, the helping. What happened with your experience in Egypt would not be quantified in any way as giving or volunteering to a 501c3 nonprofit, right? So the relational generosity that we share with one another oftentimes gets lost in the ways that we can quantify it. And in many ways, I think you're pointing to all the exchanges and relationships that we build communities together.
Absolutely. I don't think we should undermine any exchange. We should not feel that we need to measure an exchange for it to be valid.
Well, I want to open it up to our audience here. Are those of you here that we have some microphones you might can see? Just raise your hand and we'd be glad to let you join into this conversation. I see Dr. Saylor back there. Maybe you could introduce yourself, Rob, and ask your question, Dr. Siddiqui.
Can you hear me? There we go. Rob Saylor, I teach at Christian Theological Seminary. Thank you very much for this talk. I feel like your lecture was encouraging us to question some of our habits of speaking of justice as a static goal to arrive at. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what might change if we think of justice as perpetually and constitutively dynamic. How would our habits of speaking about justice change if it is dynamic rather than a static goal?
Well, I don't think it's static. Yeah, I don't think justice is ever a destination you arrive at. I think it's a constant work in progress. But, I mean, I'm just thinking about a very practical example of what's happening in the UK at the moment, where we have a number of public sector workers striking. Whether it's the trains, I think they've actually reached an agreement now. But nurses, teachers, now junior doctors are going to go on strike. And it's like, who is actually working? Every week somebody is saying that they will go on strike. And the reason for that is because they feel that the system has been unjust to them. That not just in terms of salary or wealth, but in terms of if you want society to feel good, for people to feel valued, then you have to invest in the things that make people feel valued. They need to have good health care that's accessible. And you know the NHS has always been free at the point of contact. They need to feel that their teachers are well looked after, that their children have school meals, that there are warm places for them. It's really practical things, but this word injustice has come up quite a few times, that all those people that we thought during COVID were our essential workers who kept the country alive and moving have now been discarded because we've gone back to normal. And so therefore, where is the justice in this? If justice is simply about, I will give you enough to keep you quiet, that is not justice. So justice has to be more about what is it that we value in society. And if we don't value equality a little bit more, and if we don't value a little bit more wealth distribution, I don't want to sound socialist or Marxist, but I do think that our societies have become more and more unequal. And inequality isn't just a temporary thing, it lives for generations. So then how do you transform societies if the basic structural injustices are still there? And that shows in our schools. So all the research shows that children who come from deprived and marginalized backgrounds, their futures are already mapped out in the first 2 or 3 years of their life because of all the things that they won't have rather than the things they could aspire to. So I think there are enough things around us for us to think, well, justice can be elusive, but at the same time, it can be something that we can do something about. And I think we don't use the word justice in our political language because it's too heavy. It kind of points to almost a different world. So we talk about other things that are more pragmatic. But I think we do need to bring the word justice back.
Thanks, Ralph. Avery, got one question. Carol's got a question down front.
I've been wondering if it might help change our thinking if instead of always talking about giving as the practice, we shifted to talking about receiving and giving as the practice, and acknowledge that the people we are giving to also have gifts to give us. And I get this from listening to people who participated in things like mission trips and stuff, who come back saying, I got more than I gave, because these people's tremendous welcome and hospitality just overwhelmed me. And I wonder if that also speaks to the issue of justice in the sense of, you mentioned that being paternalistic and turning people into being people who can only have gratitude is also missing, that they also have the gifts. And I just wondered about your response to that. And I think it also connects to social entrepreneurship, because that, I think, does that more. So that's unformed, but.
Thank you. I just want to be very brief. I don't think giving is about just wealth giving. I think we need to broaden the concept of giving, which is that anyone can give. It doesn't matter whether you have wealth or not. So charity, an act or a deed, even a thought, is still an act of giving. Because if you want to change the way society looks, you have to change the way people think first. And if people are not empathetic, and if people are not thinking about the collective good as much as they can, doesn't mean to say we all have to be saints. I don't mean that. But in terms of we have to create societies where people don't turn away, where people don't feel that's not my problem, it's somebody else's problem. And I don't think that we are creating societies like that. I think there are a lot of people doing immense amount of good. But generally, most of us, including me, we are self-absorbed. And it's a kind of pricking of our consciousness that, no, I can't turn away from this, I refuse to. So I have to do something. And even if I'm not giving wholeheartedly or whatever, I have to do something for that situation that makes a tiny little bit of difference. And that isn't necessarily about material wealth, absolutely.
Thanks, Carol. Pasek?
Thanks, Avery. I just want to make sure Avery gets some exercise today. So.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful, and I agree with you, especially about the imaginative possibilities of art and generosity in general. But then I wonder if I'm agreeing with you too much. So I'm also wondering, there's just a train of thought that wonders, could we be giving too much? And if we imagine utopias that are too grand or have to have utopias that we will expect huge returns, and there are dystopias and ideologies that have been used and art that has been used for nefarious purposes. So do you see at all a danger of, and you had mentioned some of your work on the limits of hospitality, but the limits of giving, because if we give too much, maybe we expect kind of otherworldly rewards and to accrue to us immediately, and that can be quite dangerous, right?
Well, this is why I think that power, we have to think about power as well. That if you give with the notion that this makes you more powerful, that is wrong. I think that is moral. Yes, of course, if you are giving huge sums, you probably are somebody in power, and you probably do have a lot of status, you know, the way we measure status in society. But I think the power dynamic is where the rub is for me. That if giving is, I don't necessarily think unconditionality is the answer, but I think that if giving is tied to a transformation that serves you primarily, then I see a problem with that. And that's where paternalism and conditionality and how you may want society to shape and curate in a way that might not be good for the people receiving your money. So again, I don't think that giving necessarily is a moral act in itself. I think it becomes a moral act when it transforms something for the better. Now, we can discuss what better looks like, but I do feel that corporations that have a lot of money and have a lot of stake in certain cultural, religious beliefs that can shape society, there's a danger there, absolutely. Because if you have so much wealth that you can curate the kind of ethics that conform to your particular way of thinking, that does not conform to what I think is the way a lot of people think, not most, but a lot of people think today about human freedom and human rights and human liberties. I think that's problematic.
Avery, really, it's not close for you, from one side to the other.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm just curious, when we talk about giving, should there be a situation where the giving is inspired by the interest of the donor? I mean, this is what I care about, and how do we connect that with the fact that you want justice within the system of the giving framework?
So, sorry, the question was, sorry, I just didn't catch the last bit.
So I'm saying that we know donor interests drive giving, right? And within the interest of the donor, organization tends to, it drives the conversation, right? Mm-hmm. And given that we might be very concerned about, justice, maybe that's not what I'm very keen about as a donor. And so given the conversation we are having, I'm just kind of struggling to conceptualize if what I care about, I feel like this is a need within the society, and maybe it doesn't fully address my own conception of justice, equality. And I caught that when you were, you mentioned that within somebody who is privileged often struggle to give up the privilege. And maybe I'm not saying it rightly, from the point of privilege. It's just something I'm very passionate about. So I'm just trying to...
Yeah, I think it's probably partially addressed to the last question, but this is why you could argue that giving has to be less donor-centric and more recipient-centric. That I can give, but if what I'm giving is only going to maybe just be a reflection of my worldview, then that's problematic. So, but it depends on the nature of your gift, and it depends on who you're giving. So I don't think this is we can generalize too much. But say I want to help women from very deprived backgrounds be able to work and also raise their children and have some agency over their lives. I can give and let them be as creative as they want with how they manage that. That doesn't have to come with any strings, and nor should it come with any strings. Because I think if you make giving too prescriptive, then your giving just becomes an extension of your ego. And that's where I think the rub might be. I don't know enough about big philanthropists and how they give. But I suspect that a lot of it is, what they want to create is a reflection maybe of, not necessarily of a utopia, but of a transformation of society. But part of it is about their own interests, how they would want society to develop. But again, I don't think we can be too general about this, because giving comes in all shapes and sizes.
And we're thinking for our next question, as we get there. So are religious traditions, as you mentioned, sort of this, once we move to human struggle, are religious traditions in some way a disruption of our human nature and help form us into this notion of giving and generosity and point us to the need to give that might be maybe contrary to our human nature?
I do think most of us have empathy. I do think that. But I don't think we nurture empathy enough as a virtue that needs to be nurtured. And I do think that most of us probably do want to do things for each other, but the way we are constantly drawn to giving to the needy in Scripture, that I think can be counterintuitive. Yeah. Yeah.
During your talk, you used the term creative minority. Mm-hmm. And I was trying to remember the context of that in terms of transformation, in terms of change. Can you unpack that a little bit and describe a little bit more about what you see as the creative minority?
So that was the quote from Arnold Toynbee, the English historian, who said that, civilizations either rise or fall based on. And I think the creative minority is the people who have the vision, the people who are going against the grain, the people who are not following the lead, the people who maybe see that there is another world that can come out of this. And we have to look for those creative minorities. We have to nurture creativity. Because creativity, I think, doesn't necessarily mean that everybody will become a disruptor, but it just means that people will be able to imagine maybe that world that we want, or the neighborhood that I want to create, isn't actually just a figment of my imagination. Maybe it can be done. It's just that I need to surround myself with the people who want to make this happen. And I think a lot of us perhaps don't have the courage or the strength to think about that how does one get like-minded people? Because I at least think that most times when you ask people for help, whatever help it can be, people are keen to help. People are keen to come together and do something that is for good. But who is the person who's going to take that initial step? Who is the person who might be ridiculed at the beginning, or who might be ignored, but still sees, no, I'm going to be relentless because I do see a better world, I do see a better neighborhood, a better street, whatever. It is those little things that change society. Because if you don't feel valued, if you feel that your neighborhood is neglected, if you feel that nobody cares about whether your school has enough books and pencils, then why would you want to do anything? Why would you want to feel citizenship? Why would you want to give back? Because you've not received anything. So I just feel that with all these things, these thoughts around hospitality and gratitude, none of these are easy virtues. They demand something of us, and they demand that we demand for people around us. But how else does anything change?
Yeah. Patrick?
So I'm an economist, and I'll try not to be too numerical about this, but quantitative and still respect the human dignity. And a lot of your talk reminded me of John Rawls' The Theory of Justice, and so that differences in income can be justified to the extent that they help with a preferential option for the poor. And one of the things that strikes me, though, is in the political sphere, people routinely vote against, they're stridently opposed to tax increases, even if they be focused on higher income, higher wealth households, and they often vote for, at least at the presidential level, people who would hurt them economically. And so I don't know if you have any insights on reconciling our seemingly irrational behavior.
You mean people voting? People voting for higher taxes?
No, they're
against
opposed
their
to
best
it,
Against their best.
especially taxes
Yeah, but-
for others.
But are people voting for personalities and people are voting rather than policies? Because I find that people do vote for personalities rather than policies. And this is why I often think that one of the things that we need to do with younger people is to make them engaged, keep them engaged with all aspects of civil society and politics with a small p as well as a large P. And I'm saying this because I'm seeing what's happening in the UK at the moment as well. I think Brexit, I chaired the group in Scotland that was for the UK staying in Scotland staying in the EU. I think Brexit was a massive failure of moral imagination, to be honest, and political imagination. But I think that people voted because they liked the thought of that one word, autonomy. We will get our nation back, all that kind of, as if we never had our nation. We were not lost in the first place. But that sense of that there is something almost magisterial about talking about doing it on your own. And when you looked at the policies, none of them made any sense. But the rhetoric was so grand that in the end, although it was 48-52, that particular vote went against what a lot of people are now saying. Even Brexiteers know this was the wrong move. This was the wrong decision. So what we're trying to do now all the time is how we can get another negotiation with the EU, which will never be as good as the one we had before. So I don't know, and I think people vote emotionally. People do most things based on feelings. We try to think of ourselves as rational beings, but we are sentient beings of feelings. We are. And I don't think necessarily we should be ashamed of that, but I think that's why all these virtues that are really about feelings need to be kept in check.
Maybe I saw Micah Hughes behind you there, and one question here. Amber, maybe you could reach out about that.
Can you hear me? Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Siddiqui. I've been following your work for some time. I come from the world of religious studies and Islamic studies as well, so I've been familiar, and it's a great honor to have you here. I was really struck by the various concepts you brought together in your talk. This idea of generosity, of hospitality, of the kind of ancient social roots of these aspects, and then also the kind of structural problems, issues, tensions we face today, and the way we'd want to mobilize these concepts to help us deal with these inequalities or these structural problems. And I think largely philanthropy has come under some kind of criticism, or big-scale philanthropy has come under criticism from the likes of Rob Reich and others who are pointing to the kind of democratic inequalities that are laden into a system where some people get to decide what causes are worth funding at the expense of those who need the funding or need the resources. So in that kind of tense moment between your encouragement to reimagine giving as something broader, as something local, and then the large-scale kind of structural problems we're facing, I wonder, how generosity, how hospitality can be used to think about the local concerns, but also speak to some of these structural questions that seem to preoccupy academics, if we are truly vulnerable to each other in a way that makes life both livable but sometimes unlivable. Mutuality is one word that I kind of wanted to throw in there, thinking about mutual aid as a response to some of these, the way in which we're constitutively tied together. And so I'm just curious, I know that's a very broad question, but how do we think about giving locally in our communities and then facing these large-scale inequalities that seem insurmountable? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. I don't think that philanthropists can replace the state, and nor should they. So this is why I would echo the work of the words of the Indian philanthropist who said, you need to work with policymakers, you need to work with the legislators, you need to work with the people who actually make the changes. Because it doesn't matter how much money you give, if the legislation isn't there to effect the change for an immeasurable amount of time, you know, the sustained change that you need, then I think giving will definitely transform something, but it won't guarantee that that change will remain. And I think this is why you do have this kind of massive, overwhelming state, public sector, big corporations on one side, and then you have this kind of scriptural roots of giving, which was always there to help. You know, to give somebody water in the desert was to keep them alive. That is not philanthropy, but that was a sort of welcome and a duty, a moral obligation, that you have a stake in my wealth, even if it's just a cup of water. So how one brings both worlds together, I think maybe philanthropists are trying to do that, but I also think that we shouldn't necessarily think of the transformation of society as something that can only be done with money or necessarily always with structural change, however important that is. And I think it is important for justice. Most of the time we feel we don't belong or belong somewhere, or we are valued or not valued, is nothing to do with corporations and governments. It's that human-to-human interaction. And I think that that is more about an attitude that is empathetic and giving rather than actual giving. And I think that is probably a bigger challenge, to be honest.
I know we have time for one last brief question and one brief response, if we can.
Hi, my name is PT, or Fung Zhang, and I'm not a big tech startup guy who can give a lot of money, but I do have a question for you. So I'm a master's student, and I'm graduating this end of the semester, so this question is really critical for what's next for me. I wanted to address the part where you were talking about scarcity and how a lot of the decisions that we make today might end up impacting not only us, but the generations behind us and so forth. So from the background of myself and many of my friends was that we couldn't have afforded this education without scholarships. We couldn't have afforded this without donors and what they've done for us. So in a way, it feels as if we came from a place of scarcity, and now with our education, for the first time, we've gotten a little bit more than just scarcity. We've got a little bit surplus, whether that be time, talent, or treasure. So as we navigate our career and our education, and we begin to be these smaller philanthropists, not that big philanthropists, what type of advice would you have for us in how we can set boundaries that keep us and the practices that we do safe, but also in a way that allows us to continue to give? I think that the question here is coming from a place where you don't have much, and you're being helped so much, and so it's so abundantly clear that you want to give it back one day, but not being ready to do that. And so we have to think smart, but start small, but we just don't know where.
I think you can always give. And it's not about scarcity. I mean, going back to the example of the woman who put out the cardboard mat for me, she had nothing. You know, she literally had nothing. They lived in a little hovel below the flat. So I don't think it's necessarily about, I keep saying this, I know, it's not necessarily about material wealth. You will, hopefully you will get to a stage where you too can give back just the way you received. But then the challenge is, when you get to that stage, will you want to give back? And how do you actually nurture a sense of a faithful life is a life of giving back? Not because it's your choice, but because it's your duty. So I think, and I would say this to all young people, that I think the younger generation are far more generous than people give them credit. Their thinking is generous, the way they want to see the world is generous. But everybody gets older, and everybody gets solidified in their way of thinking at times. And I think the way to be is, how do you stay hopeful and imaginative and not forget that you also owe, that you don't just receive.
Well, I know you'll want to help me to thank Dr. Siddiqui for this wonderful idea. We are really grateful for Dr. Siddiqui for offering our 18th annual Thomas Lake Lecture, and really grateful for you all for being here, to engaging with these conversations. The community that we've built around these lectures is really important to us, and I'd be remiss if I didn't thank specifically Ann Brock, who's about to walk out of the room. My colleagues Tasha Gibson and Amber Harder and so many others at Lake Institute. And all of our colleagues at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at IUPUI who've helped make this possible. We're really grateful for all the engagement. And we do have the wonderful ability to actually meet in person these last few years. So we really would love to invite you, if you could stay for just a few minutes, to connect with one another, because that's what we've learned today is really key, is this relational capacity around giving. So just around to the fellowship hall, we have some refreshments. We hope you'd stay for a few minutes and just connect with one another. And we're grateful for your time, and thanks so much for coming.